Hello and welcome to this webinar brought to you in association with the World Maritime University and the ITF Seafarers Trust. I'm Richard Mead, editor of Lloyd's List, and today we are talking about fatigue. The dangerous consequences of fatigue among crew has been well documented by casualty investigators globally for decades, and yet tackling systemic non-compliance with working hours regulations has remained a stubbornly routine problem for the shipping industry. But a new study conducted by the World Maritime University has confirmed what we've known for a long time, that the industry has a problem with fatigue, and that while the regulations around work and rest hours are there, they are confusing. The records maintained to demonstrate compliance with these standards are habitually falsified. There is a culture throughout the industry of adjusting records to give the impression of compliance with regulation and maintain smooth operations of the vessel. Now, it's not necessarily going to be new news to many of you listening today, but we've seen several reports on this and studies in the past. What we have in front of us now, though, courtesy of the WMU, is a statistically significant study that could be used to start looking for action on this issue. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. I'm going to be handing over shortly to the authors of the study to briefly present the key findings, and then we're going to be discussing the implications of what all this means. Why is it so significant, and what happens next? Now, that's when we come to the panel of experts, but we're also going to be coming to you and taking questions. So as you're listening, please feel free to submit your questions. We will do our best to get to them, and as we discuss the issues raised by this study, I'll try and bring you into the conversation as well. Now, I'm told that we will have this webinar available on demand at some point. So if you're listening and you're interested in what you're hearing, please make sure you bookmark it and come back and pass it on to colleagues, because it's going to be an interesting discussion. And personally, I would like to see this broadcast as widely as possible across the industry. Now, I'm going to introduce you to our international panel of experts shortly, but I want to start with the report itself, and who better to lead you through the headlines than the authors themselves. Professor Raphael Baumler, he's the head of the Maritime Safety and Environmental Administration at the World Maritime University in Sweden, and Captain Bikram Bhatia, a doctoral researcher at the WMU. Gentlemen, the briefest of overviews from you, if you don't mind, and then I'll be inviting you to join our panel for discussion afterwards. But over to you.
Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. It is an honor to present the findings from our report, Quantifying an Inconvenient Truth, Revisiting a Culture of Adjustment on Work-Rest Hours. I'm Captain Bikram Bhatia, a PhD candidate at World Maritime University and a former chemical tanker shipmaster. I would like to thank the expert panelists and everyone joining us online. Special thanks to my team for their support, to the ITF Seafarers Trust for funding this research, to the 51 organizations for supporting this research in various capacities, and to 6,304 seafarers for their valuable input. The report, Quantifying an Inconvenient Truth, builds on our earlier qualitative multi-stakeholder study, A Culture of Adjustment, which was composed of 71 interviews and 2 focus groups. Our previous report was well received and discussed by the shipping community. However, it also faced criticism at the ILO STC, where inaccurate concerns were raised on the methodology and the sample size. To address these concerns, we conducted a global survey, resulting in a report based on 6,304 seafarers' responses. This sample size surpasses the recommended sample size for a seafaring population by 16.4 times. Due to the voluntary nature of the survey, not all questions were answered. Therefore, the number of responses for each question is represented by N in the report. One of the questions was about seafarers' work characteristics. Seafarers reported working 11.5 hours daily and 74.9 hours weekly. This weekly work hours of 74.9 is significantly higher than the 43 hours per week for non-maritime workers as identified by the ILO in their report in 2018. Notably, 78.3% of seafarers have no full day off during their entire contract period. In short, this data confirms that seafarers work non-stop. The following slides present data on non-compliance with work rest and related recording practices. In response to question about non-compliance with work rest limit, 88.3% reported non-compliance at least once a month, with 16.5% exceeding limit more than 10 times per month. Additionally, 64.3% seafarers admitted to adjusting their records when limits were exceeded, while only 31.6% do not adjust their records. The finding on adjustment confirms previous 30 evidences, which include qualitative study, quantitative studies, casualty investigation reports, and a government report. Additionally, each finding in the report was verified using available literature. Notably, existing literature validated our findings. We also asked seafarers about their justification for adjustment. The primary reason was to avoid any finding during inspections and to avoid problem with the company. Again, these findings confirm our previous report and other literature. Apart from this survey report, we have published a paper in a reputable scientific journal. In this paper, we compared seafarers' reported compliance data as shown in earlier slide with the port state control concentrated inspection campaign conducted during the survey period. The comparison of data shows complete divergence, where seafarers reported a low compliance rate of about 12%, the port state control reported a much higher compliance rate of about 96%. These data from seafarers and PSC lies on opposite extremes of work rest compliance spectrum. This gap clearly demonstrates that adjustment is a successful strategy to pass inspections without deficiencies. This gap was further examined. Therefore, we combined previous culture of adjustment data with the new PSC interview data to explore work rest inspection practices. As a result, 55 interviews with port state control officers were processed. This sample size represents the largest sample size ever for this group. The outcome of this work is currently under review. Here are the two quotes illustrating some challenges PSC officers face during work rest inspection. The first quote highlights difficulty in checking a ship during a short time inspection, forcing port state control to prioritize what comes to their eyes. The second quote indicates that seafarers don't really show non-compliance information, and some companies control seafarers' record in order to produce documents that are well put together. So what are the implications of adjustment to fatigue risk management framework? Let's understand how fatigue risk management framework in shipping works. Scientific literature emphasizes that workload and staffing balance and working time limits constitute foundational layer of fatigue risk management. In shipping, these foundational layers are represented by manning and work rest regulation. Therefore, compliance with work rest is essential to keep this foundation and the overall fatigue risk management framework intact. In theory, the compliance is demonstrated by records maintained by seafarers. In theory, any non-compliance must be reported and the company respond to them in order to restore compliance. Flag state must be made aware of recurring non-compliances. In such cases, the flag state reviews or potentially withdraws the minimum safe manning document. In theory, the intervention by the company first and the flag state second would restore the foundational layer of fatigue risk management. However, the practice depicts a different picture because the adjustment of record hinders non-compliance information to circulate. Feedback to the company and to the authorities disappear, putting the compliance with minimum standard and fatigue management in danger. We conclude this presentation by reinforcing that this new report confirms finding from our previous report on a culture of adjustment. Adjustment obscure non-compliance, prevent any feedback for improvement, and erode the foundation of fatigue management. On behalf of the WMU team, I want to thank you all for the opportunity to present our research finding. We look forward to the discussion or any comments or questions that you may have. Thank you.
Excellent. Well, some food for thought there, definitely. We are going to be coming to some of the details, and we're going to be pulling you both in to help us understand some of the context. But this is about much more than just the academic research. This is about the context of lots of anecdotal evidence over many years. It's about the context of the regulatory changes, the regulatory problems, and how we now use this research and try and push on this issue. So I'm going to bring in our expert panel at this point. We have with us Beatrice Vercato. She's the head of Maritime Unit at the International Labour Standards Department at the ILO in Geneva. We have Dr. Michelle Gretsch, the Manager of Vessel Operations at the Australian Maritime Safety Authority, AMSA, and Leanne van der Veen, the Chair of the Marine Accident Investigations International Forum, MAIF, and is currently working as a Senior Marine Accident Investigator at the Dutch Safety Board in the Netherlands. Welcome, esteemed panel. Now, we may be joined at some point also by a representative from the IMO. But for the moment, Beatrice, you are holding up the regulatory panel here. So I'm going to start with you, if you don't mind, to give us the overview that we're missing from that introduction. We know what's going wrong, but why? What's the problem with the regulatory discrepancies as we see it in terms of the work rest hours? Give us the broad intro in terms of what the problems are from your perspective.
Well, thank you very much. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
I was going to take another angle to what I was going to say, because first of all, I just wanted to really thank WMU for this research, because in this very tricky issue, what we need is data to address the problems. And I think, as it was said, this research builds on previous research. I think it's also important to say from the outset that I would like to invite, and I think from the international community, anyone who disagrees with this funding, so any actors who might have different views, to build on this research, because what we need is data to tackle the problem. Some of the issues that were raised by the colleagues concerning inspection and the role of port state control are true for many other provisions of the MLC. Inspectors lack the training, lack the capacity, and the time is very limited to enforce this. So that's an area where we need, and this is not new. During the pandemic, we had this task force with the IMO, and one of the key findings was that in general, we need to provide to enhance the capacity of inspectors to inspect the MLC. And here, not only looking at the hours of work, but cross-checking data, looking at the logbook, all these things that experts know. Not all experts have that information. So that is very important. And I think from a regulatory perspective, something we are seeing is that the industry somehow has not yet integrated the MLC when it comes to manning. We had IMO regulations regarding manning and minimum safe manning, but then we had the MLC, which came to say that when determining that those manning levels, we need to take into account all the services that that ship is provided to ensure that hours of work are respected, that fatigue is addressed, that not only fatigue, that catering is addressed. And therefore, now the cook, which is not in the IMO context, form part of that minimum manning, if we want. And why is this related? And I think Bikram and the report clearly said, because if we do not have enough people on board, it's not possible materially to comply with the hours of work and the hours of rest regulations. And therefore, when we will look at these issues, we certainly have to take this into account. And I don't want to finish because, as you know, the ILO, it's a tripartite organization. So I think it's very important that I say here from the outset that how is this research going to be used? ILO, we cannot say, but what I can say is that the issue of hours of work is on the table of the upcoming special tripartite committee meeting of the MLC. And I'm sure that the actors, the tripartite constituents, seafarers, ship owners, and governments representatives will benefit enormously from this research to guide their discussions. And the final point here also is that whatever solution we can find will have to be made or found in cooperation with the IMO, since these two organizations have a joint mandate on this issue, and we've seen again and again that we are stronger when we work together. We ILO are stronger to protect seafarers' rights when we support and work together with the IMO on this. Thank you.
I think it's a really important point, and one that I probably should have mentioned at the outset. We are having this conversation in a context where there is a wider discussion at play. I mean, we've mentioned the IMO. We may be joined by a representative from the IMO shortly, but the point is we're not talking here with ship owners. We are not talking here with the wider stakeholders. And as Beatrice points out, this is a conversation that is multifarious. It is difficult. It is complicated. It is not a binary question of right and wrong and coming up with a single solution. There is a wider context here. But I think what this report offers is, as you point out, the data with which we can now do something. We can't tackle a problem until we can actually measure it. So I think it's probably a good point to sort of bring Raphael in. In the context of this discussion, and the context of these 6,000 responses, do you get the impression that the industry has acknowledged that it has an issue? And what does that say about where we start this conversation? Are we at least in the position now that we can acknowledge that there is a problem and there needs to be something done about it?
Thank you very much. Very interesting question, and to see what is happening now in the industry. There is a variety of industries, I would say, within the shipping industry. And we can say there is definitely, we have very good contact with many shipping companies where you can see this willingness to address the issue. But overall, as we've seen with bigger data, we see that the problem is still remaining. I mean, you will see in the report that some shipping companies are very proactive when they receive this information, there are violations, they really do their job, they really put additional people on board, but it's not always the case. And this is something that the industry has to really take care of very seriously, because they can have also some legal implications in case of casualty and so on. You know, if it can be demonstrated that there have been some violations which been even concealed by the crew member. So there is a lot of elements, but I'm pretty convinced now, and we had recently a workshop at the WMU with multi-stakeholders workshop, including shipping companies and representative of the international organizations. And here we have seen that they were the idea of looking forwards and moving forward. So I would be rather optimistic for the future, but it's very difficult to see. But it took at least so many years to come back to what we were 20 years ago. When I say that 20 years ago, I come back to this research which was done 20 years ago by the University of Cardiff, which already highlighted the problem. And I would say from the ship owning side, the problem is known because in 2009, when they were, during the Manila Convention the Manila Amendment discussion, there were some papers by the ship owners highlighting also the need to address the problem of violations and especially addressing the problem of forging of records. So it's a known problem. It has been highlighted in the past by research. It has been highlighted also by casualty investigators. It has been highlighted also in the past by ship owners associations. But it seems that it has not been moving a lot. But now we hope that it's going to move faster. And we have some signs. I mean, different companies are taking more interest in this topic. And we start to see signs about changes.
Good. We'll come back to you on a few of those points. But Michelle, I want to ask you the same question. This is not a new issue. This has been discussed, at least for the last 20 years since I've been covering shipping as a topic. Why are we now only at this point? And do you think that the industry has started to acknowledge that there is a problem?
Yes, thanks, Richard, for this question. And I'd like to thank WMU for inviting me here today. I suppose I have been working in this space for a number of years. I was actually quite heavily involved in the implementation or the review of the guidelines on fatigue, where we revisited how we can actually frame the actual fatigue risk management approach, which was actually designed specifically for the shipping industry. What we're finding with this particular study is that it's actually provided us further evidence, obviously, to continue to support the current issue, which, as you know, and as you mentioned, we've known this particular problem for a very long time. But to some extent, I found that the industry was kind of a little bit reluctant in tackling this issue, and mainly because it was very difficult, like the study has provided, for example, it's very difficult to identify non-compliance with this particular issue. So to some extent, it's kind of been hidden under the radar. And it's the seafarers, to some extent, were forced to accept the situation. So then we're leading to this concept of seafarers being exposed to higher workload and obviously the risk of fatigue, which we know have led to multiple consequential casualties, which is problematic. But now we see this issue coming to light a bit more because post-COVID, we're seeing this being more of a problem. And it all points to the first line of defense, which Bikram actually mentioned in his presentation. And that's what we put in when we actually put the framework together. So when we look at the concept of appropriate crewing or appropriate manning, that's where we need to focus on, because that's where the problem is. When you don't have enough people to actually meet the hours of work and rest on board the ship, that means that we have a problem with the outcomes. So we've got the safety outcomes, plus the consequence of what that does to seafarers in relation to being exposed to the risk of fatigue all the time or constantly. So the concept of crewing or manning is a really important line of defense. And to some extent, one of the issues that, to some extent, what we see is the disparity of how determinations, or what we refer to as minimum safe crewing determinations or manning determinations, are being put together. So you could have the same ship doing the same operation, and you could have a disparate number of people on those two particular ships only because they operate under different flag states. So what we're seeing is that there's not enough clarity in relation to that regulatory framework to make sure that there's consistency in how those particular vessels are operating and making sure there's the appropriate number of people on board the vessel. And this then points to safety management system, the ISM code, because the ISM code is very clear about appropriate manning, having appropriate manning to manage safe ship operations. So I suppose the question is our regulatory framework adequate at the moment to ensure that there's consistent application of what constitutes minimum safe crewing on board ships to make sure that the risk of fatigue is considered and ensure that the vessel, as per safety management system, continues to operate safely.
You've you've deliberately jumped to the solutions here, and I think it's important that we have almost two discussions here, because the research points to issues of fatigue and the issues of this culture of adjustment, as described in the report. The solutions to those, now that becomes a lot more political and a lot more controversial once we start talking about safe manning hours and opening up the regulatory rule book on this on a flag state basis. But we will come to that. But before we do, Leanne, from a statistical point of view, because I mean, you're looking at this from a marine accident investigator's position. You're looking at this in retrospect, and I think it's really important that when we're talking about fatigue and the implications of fatigue, we talk about why it is so important. So, give us the overview in terms of what this says, why it is so important, and what you see when you are looking at the consequences of fatigue here.
Yeah, thank you, Richard. The thing is, if we, as you said, we look in retrospect when something happens. When I ask for the work rest hour forms, I think 99 out of 100 are meticulously filled in, and they tick all the boxes. So that is one of the issues that is in the report as well. So that is not the evidence that we use, because to me it's useless, because as a seafarer I know that it's not always perfect, your working hours. What we see is that if you so we do our investigations to learn, not to see violations or those kinds of things, but we really want to come to a solution to make it better. So what we also see is that the seafarers that we see after an accident mainly say, well, yeah, we know about fatigue, but that never happens to us. So that's also an interesting point of view. We try to do our best, like the regulations say, you have maximum hours, blah, blah, blah. But the persons on board, they have to do their job in their community that they're in 24/7. And an issue that we see is that they say, well, no, fatigue, that doesn't happen to me. So to me, that is also an interesting point of view. And it's also in the report that there's a significant gap in research on how our fatigue restraining or mitigation strategies implemented on board, or how can we help them on board to do something about it, instead of just looking at port state control, looking at the work rest hours, or concentrate on manning. But I think we also need to look at it from a point of view from the seafarers.
Just before we move on from you, Leanne, I think it's interesting that we are having this conversation. As we've all alluded to, this is not new. We have seen these reports and various anecdotal pieces of evidence coming up through the years. But we're having this conversation post-COVID. Now, we all know what happened during COVID in terms of seafarers effectively being left on board ships for extended periods. We know fatigue was an issue. But from your perspective, do you think the conversation has changed? Has there been an acknowledgement post-COVID that this issue of the conditions on board and what happens on paper versus reality is now more significant?
I want to think that it is, but I do not have any evidence that that it really is the case. Of course, I talk to my colleague investigators a lot, and we have some suspects, but we do not have the evidence for that yet.
Maybe I could bring in Raphael and Bikram here. I mean, in terms of the interviewing and the discussions, I mean, what were you getting in terms of feedback? Are you getting the sense that there is a changing recognition that this is an issue, or is this still being swept under the carpet as far as you're concerned?
Hi, thank you, Richard, for the question. We've been doing the survey with seafarers, and obviously they pointed out on the issue, and also when we interviewed the port state control inspectors, and they also acknowledged the issue. And not only this, seafarers and port state control, but we've also interviewed port shipping companies. We got around 25 interviews with the shipping company. They also acknowledge this as an issue, but they feel that this is something which is beyond their control. And one way of dealing with this is adjusting the records, because they have their own limitations and constraints to ensure compliance. So when we talk to people, I mean there is the acknowledgement that there is a problem, but how to deal with it is something which they see beyond their control.
Okay. Let's go back into the regulatory discussion, because we've mentioned the ILO, and Beatrice, you're there. You know exactly what's happening in terms of the MLC, but this is a conversation that doesn't just get solved within the ILO. We have to factor in industry, we have to in flag state, port state control, and of course the IMO. Just give us the overview in terms of are there any discrepancies between what the IMO says and what the ILO says?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for raising that point, because indeed there is a contradiction, or a discrepancy at least, between STCW and the MLC when we speak about hours of work and hours of rest. What is this discrepancy is that the STCW allows for exceptions that are not allowed under the MLC unless they are contained in a collective bargaining agreement. Collective bargaining agreement means that you have heard the seafarers, and that maybe seafarers can obtain something in as a compensation. Okay, you're ready to work a bit more, however you will obtain something. That's the logic of having that only authorized through collective bargaining. And when we assess legislations here, we see that all countries have copy pasted the STCW, and so we end up criticizing those legislations who take into account the IMO legislation. So there is a need to address that, and to my knowledge, there is an ongoing review of STCW now, and I'm not sure if this issue has been raised. I understand that the discussion is more focused on training and not necessarily on hours of work and rest. So there is just a message for some people there. But another thing I want to just briefly touch is the issue of the softwares that are used to register these hours of work and rest. Because I've heard from maritime administrations that, of course, companies are relying on these softwares, and some softwares tell you what you are, they will have a red light if something is not in conformity, and their publicity is with both STCW and MLC. However, ILO is not involved. It has never audited or checked those softwares, and I think it's another area where we think we need to do more, because we need to give responsible ship owners a clear tool that they can use to make sure that they are compliant for those who have ratified the two conventions, those two areas. And also another interesting angle I just wanted to flag here is that we recently at the ILO and the IMO, sorry, the colleagues will use the right terminology, but there was this amendment to the STCW courses regarding violence and harassment. And in that context, it was acknowledged, these are small words, it's the content of the training of seafarers, but it was acknowledged that there is a link between fatigue, stress, and violence. So when we want to tackle violence, and as you know, we have a strong commitment by all actors here, the ship owners, governments, and seafarers, to tackle violence, we cannot completely separate this violence from the stress, the fatigue. I think any of us can become a violent person if you are under extreme workload for very, very long periods of service on board. So I think just to mention that when we are trying to regulate this, is that there will be an amendment, several amendments to the MLC to regulate violence, which is excellent, but we cannot completely forget where not only, but that violence can also come as a consequences of this. And also from the regulatory point of view, as you pointed out, during the pandemic, we faced this, we witnessed this very terrible situation for seafarers, and one issue was suicide of seafarers. Many seafarers, we don't have the exact numbers now, and thanks to Australia, Michelle, who initiated this amendment to the MLC, we will have a global register of seafarers. However, how these suicides, these are linked or not with this extreme fatigue is something we will have to find out, and more research will be needed there. They are certainly not absolutely disconnected, because we hear the people who are exhausted. They are really, they just want, they cannot see any solution, and then they commit suicide. So all these other elements that are part of the regulations have to be taken in a holistic way, I would say.
Michelle, on that point, I mean, the industry is notoriously poor at collating reliable records on an industry-wide basis. We have, black holes in national administrations. We have discrepancies in terms of how numbers are calculated, from not even on a national basis, but a sub-national basis. And the international picture we know is riddled with inconsistencies. But how important do you think a piece of research like this is in terms of furthering the agenda within bodies like the IMO and the ILO? Can we now use these numbers to do something about this?
Yeah, Richard, absolutely. I mean, what also this particular research has identified is that we do have a breakdown in that feedback loop. So, and to some extent, seafarers are helpless in making any changes in this case, because it's very clear that the hours of work and rest, to some extent, are meant to actually provide that feedback mechanism, as Bikram showed. So it's meant to provide that feedback mechanism that if it's not working, that if I'm not meeting the hours of work and rest, then I should actually report that. And that means that the company should adjust, my watchkeeping schedule, or potentially add more people on board the vessel to make sure that we continue to meet those hours of work and rest. But there's a breakdown. That's not working, because to some extent, the seafarers feel compelled to adjust those records, because they don't feel, they feel they have to pull that kind of line. So from an industry, we really need to question what can we do to make sure that we continue to create that even playing field, but also ensure that those particular requirements continue to be in compliance, because they are meant to be there for a reason. Like Beatrix mentioned, when people are subjected to the risk of fatigue, or when they are fatigued, it does not just impact direct safe operation of the vessel, but it also impacts how people behave as well, also impacts their long-term health issues. So it really impacts everything about people's health and seafarers' health. So in order for us to ensure that those particular elements are being complied with, we need to look at it more holistically, because this is a real complex issue, and look further up the chain in relation to what can we do to make sure that those particular hours of work and records are being maintained. And from my perspective, the way I see this is it's very much linked to the aspect of manning or crewing. So crewing is key, because it's the first layer of defense in relation to having those right number of people. So the question is, how do we tackle this? How do we make sure there's consistent implementation and proper implementation of ensuring that there's enough people on board the vessel, properly qualified and crewed, to be able to conduct all safe operations on board the vessel, as per the ISM code as well.
How much of this is about the top level standards, whether we're talking about the MLC or STCW, being opposed to each other? How much of it is that top level issue, and how much of this is about the discrepancy between the national flag administrations and how they are implemented? I mean, on pretty much every level, if I compared, say, the likes of Liberia or the UK, or any of the flags in the top of the port state control list versus the old favorites in Gabon, Eswatini, Comoros, I could go on. My point being, there is no such thing as a standard flag these days. There are, the good, the bad, and the barely compliant, and all shades of grey in between. How much of this is about that discrepancy, and how much of this is about the need to overhaul stuff within institutions like IMO and ILO, do you think? Beatrice, I guess that's probably back to you, I'm afraid. Sorry.
No, and that's fine. No, I think it's very important to put things in perspective. This discrepancy between STCW and MLC is not the reason for the findings and all what is going on out there. So I think it's important to flag it, but that's something we need to work on, but it's not the main reason. I think the key issue is fair competition here, and I keep hearing from maritime administrations that if they become a bit tougher regarding manning, since it has a cost, some will leave to other flags. And here I join, or support what Michelle was saying. There is a need to have consistency, and here we would be helping responsible ship owners and responsible maritime administrations to say, these are the rules. How, etc. That's I'm not going to enter into the details because that's something that the actors will have to say. But I think it's very important to address the fact that some administrations, we've been told, are fixing manning without taking into account at all the operations of the ship. And these, and with concrete examples, if a ship is going from one port to the other, this is what they take into account, regardless if that ship enters in 15 ports in between, which means, of course, much more work for the seafarers. Others will fix this manning taking into account the power, horses of power of the ship, and without necessarily reviewing every time what is this ship actually doing. And so the issue that minimum safe manning take into account the safety concerned is one aspect, but also we have to take into account decent working conditions for seafarers. That's, I'm not inventing, that's already in the MLC. The regulation 2.7 says when determining manning levels, maritime administrators have to take into account all the safety concerns, the fatigue, but also comply with MLC provisions. And decent work, it's at the heart of the MLC. Recently, we have all this conference about welfare of seafarers. Well, we call it decent work. But indeed, and I've been visiting ships where the seafarers showed us the gym, and I said, look at the gym, it's very nice. We never have time to come to the gym. It's impossible, forget it, that we can use it. So when we take into account about, we wanted to attract and retain seafarers and attract and retain young seafarers, we need to address these issues. We can no longer speak only about safety, which is very important for the planet, for pollution, and for many other reasons. We also need to take into account this decent work aspect and this aspect of welfare of seafarers.
A related point is raised here by one of our listeners. I think it's a very good one. They point out that on your slide, Raphael, we've got 11.7% of the seafarers who didn't adjust their records. Now, the question is, was any analysis done of why those seafarers didn't change them? Was it a company culture? Was it higher crewing levels? Was it because they weren't able to do so? Do we have any sort of idea of what good or the absence of bad looks like? And I know they're not necessarily the same thing, but if there are people adhering to the rules, how come they can, but the majority can't? Any insight there?
Okay, just a small clarification. The 11.7% is about the violation per month.
Right.
It's not about the adjustment of records. There is about 30% of the seafarers replied that they never adjust records, or they don't adjust records. Why with 31%? And here we can have different explanation. The first explanation here, it's from a pure research point of view, and it has been pointed out previously in previous quantitative research on the same topic, say that some people may be reluctant in admitting that they are adjusting the record. So we can have this one. This is a pure methodological point of view. The second point is they don't need. I mean, some seafarers working in some good environments, and they definitely don't need to adjust any records because the work operation, the manning level is appropriate and it works. And this is why we have, it's what I said before. I mean, there is many industries within this big industry. So some segment of the industry are definitely doing their best. And the shipping company are doing their best that everything works perfectly. And this is happening. It's probably this 30% of them, while the 2/3 have definitely a problem. And that's where we are. So we have an industry players which are really doing by the book or try to do their best, and some other ones are not. And here I just want to come back to what was saying Beatrice before. the idea of a level playing field. And when you start to have ships which are operating with people which are overworked all the time, which are violating the rest hours, and in addition, which are adjusting the records, it means that they're most probably for the same type of trade, they're in competition with a ship which is not violating. This ship will have probably more people on board, because the workload will be probably similar, but more people on board. And therefore, it's becoming a disincentive for the ship owner, because say, look, where is the level playing field? And here, one of the key points that we wanted to bring in this research from the 2020 to the one today is basically the problem of the control mechanisms. Because of course we can say mining, company, seafarers, but I think we should not stop here. Control mechanisms are extremely important. Flag state is there. What is doing the flag state? The flag state is not only issuing a manning level, which is sometimes questionable, but the flag state has also a duty to verify that the regulations are up to what they are expected to do, and here to verify what is really happening on board. So the flag state has definitely a responsibility here, a duty to verify that. In addition to this, another layer of control, which proved to be also unsatisfactory, is with PSC, post-state control, because when you see this gap between this 11.7% of the seafarers who are never violating rest hours versus 96% of compliance, according to, the gap is so big that we can really much question what is the practice today of PSCO. We work with PSCO because PSCO, according to the IMO guidance, are basically people which were before flag state inspectors. So it means that for us, it was an easy way to play more or less with the game. We still keep the idea of PSCO, but we can more or less think that most probably they had the same kind of practice previously. But we are not sure about that, but we can probably think about it. And what we've seen is PSCO, in fact, are a very short time to do a lot of things. I remember an interview and in focus group, because we have two group work with PSC officers, in addition to 55 interviews, we have two research work with them. And one was saying, look, I have 97 items or plus to verify when I'm joining the vessel, and I have only 2 hours. How come? So basically, we were just got very fast because they have to complete this. They have also to report to their own organizations what they are doing, and they have to demonstrate that the checklist have been through. So it's a pretty complicated situation also for post-state control officers. The issue is very much after how it became completely accepted and normalized within the industry that, okay, seafarers are not doing very much a job in terms of reporting. Companies are overlooking at it. Flag state is just forgetting it. And PSCO do not very much have time to dig inside. So we have this kind of acceptability, which became a little bit puzzling. And this was one of the points of our first report, to say how much it is known information, in fact. And everybody is having, I would say, something can do better. Everyone can do a little bit better and better.
I think it's a really important point, because I think you could cherry pick some of the evidence here and point to lack of standards from port state control or flag state or the seafarers themselves. It's all of them. And there is no universal standard here. And I'm going to come back to Leanne here, because I mean, we've talked about the discrepancies between the good, the bad, and the ugly when it comes to flag state. The same, I would argue, is applicable to port state control. When we get to the standard of marine accident investigation and the evidence of these problems coming to the fore, I would argue probably the same is true. We know that, up until fairly recently, around just over 50 to 60% of the flag state investigations of the really serious casualty accidents that should have been being published on the IMO were never making it there. Now, that has improved slightly over the last 5 to 7 years, but it is still a massive issue. And that feedback loop, the findings of casualty reports, the findings of wherever it is coming from, flag state, port state, they're not necessarily going back into the feed into the feedback in a way that is raising this issue. So I wonder, listening to this conversation, listening to all of the evidence that's being presented, do you think that, this issue of seafarer fatigue, is perhaps put down the agenda a little bit in terms of what people are looking at when they are looking for problems? Or is this, as the report suggests, just a cultural issue that's been left to fester, I guess?
Yeah, thanks, Richard. And of course, I'm the first to admit that not every accident report is on time, is as in-depth as we would like. And they're obviously also better than other. But as you just said, you see that everywhere. What we try to do as accident investigators is we try to get to the bottom, but it's not always possible. And some take more time than other. But it's really important to us investigators, when we investigate something, we really want it to be based on good evidence, and that sometimes takes time. So what we try to promote within MAVE is to come to certain standards, also on the basis of fatigue and how to investigate. And for us accident investigators, that is also a bit of a tricky problem, as I say, because I am a naval architect. I like zeros and ones. But when it comes to people, it's not zeros and ones. So circumstances that are giving you fatigue maybe do not apply to me. So we try to educate the investigators to have the basics to investigate, but it's not always for every investigative body possible to come up with really good evidence on this topic. The other thing I wanted to mention, and there are some good comments in the questions and answers. Maybe fatigue is I'm pretty sure fatigue is not only about work and rest hours registration, because as we all know, the maritime industry is the only industry where you work and live 24/7 on the same area, not that big, with the same people for quite some time. And it can be very different from the officers than from deck cadets or deck officers. But there's a question about the length of a contract and the length of a time you should stay on board. And I think apart from the manning issue, maybe that is an area we really need to look into. Whether the contracts need to be that long.
Thank you. We are running out of time, but Beatrice, I know you have been joined by a friend. I assume that is Ismael Gobos Delgado. Yes. Welcome belatedly to the panel, Ismael. For those who aren't aware, this is Ismael from the Operational Safety and Human Element Maritime Safety Division of the IMO, the International Maritime Organization, more usually found down on Albert Embankment in IMO's HQ, but in Geneva, luckily for us today with Beatrice. So you're coming in late to this conversation, so you're missing a little bit of context, but this issue of how the IMO and the ILO together can deal with fatigue. Can you just give us a quick overview from your perspective on what needs to happen next? Because I'm right in saying that the STW Convention, the Standards of Training and Watchkeeping, that is under review, isn't it?
Yeah, thank you very much, and apologies for being late today. Well, in fact, something that we are doing in IMO is quite relevant to the conversation, I would say, because it relates to the seafarers' hours of work and rest and fatigue. It's not in the biennial agenda of the Maritime Safety Committee, which would entail that we would immediately start the work on this area, but it is on the post-biennial agenda. And this was based on a submission, a document that was submitted in 2021 to the Maritime Safety Committee. And it was submitted by France, Spain, the UK, IFSMA, ITF, and WMU. And there was a proposal to initiate a scoping exercise with a view to enhancing the effectiveness of provisions related to seafarers' hours of work and rest, and also on fatigue. So the Maritime Safety Committee in 2021, and that was based also on a study conducted by WMU, decided to put this agenda item on the post-biennial agenda. So it is there waiting for us to start the work. And in addition to putting this agenda item, this output on the post-biennial, decided or agreed that any follow-up work that should be carried out after the scoping exercise should be carried out in coordination with ILO. So we are going to cooperate in these areas, definitely. And we are waiting for member states pulling this output from the post-biennial agenda to the biennial agenda in order to initiate the work. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. A very useful update there. We are running out of time, but I want to very, very quickly from each of you. We deliberately haven't gone too far into the manning issue because I personally think that that is a conversation that needs to be done in conjunction with industry representatives in order to have a fair and balanced conversation. But just looking into the future, a very quick 1 minute view from each of you. What needs to happen next in terms of accelerating some action on this issue of fatigue? And I'm going to start with Raphael.
Okay, so thank you very much. It's a very, very difficult question. I mean, for a researcher, for us, is to have more projects. But what will be in a political terms to happen next? I think it's probably for the IMO and the ILO. But I will not repeat what was said by Ismail. I think it's pretty clear. And I think there is also the need also for seafarers to understand that. I've seen a question more or less in the Q&A. Highlighting that the seafarers must be made aware of the meaning of violating rest hours and what's happening if they are adjusting. I think it's probably having a campaign towards seafarers saying it's time to stop this. That's maybe a first step.
Okay. Michelle, any thoughts very quickly?
Yeah, thanks. It took me a lot more to find the unmute button. I suppose, as we mentioned previously, we need to create that even playing field. And to some extent, MSC does clearly articulate the need to consider fatigue when the manning is put together by the company and approved by the flag state. And to some extent, it would be good for IMO to replicate a similar approach. And that could be done potentially through the ISM code or even through other legislative requirements. So the need to consider fatigue is critical to ensure that that's considered when the appropriate manning or minimum safe manning determinations are put together. So I think that would be a really good aspect to start with from a legislative perspective to make sure that we create an even playing field.
Excellent. Leanne?
Yeah, thanks. For me, the next step is on page 24 of the report, where it says that we need to fill the gap. There were research concerning the effectiveness of fatigue mitigation strategies and their implementation within the broader maritime industry.
Perfect. Bikram?
Thank you, Richard. I will provide the generic recommendations, and I think obviously we need to do more research and need to have more funding to do research on what should be the next way forward. I mean, there should be a recognition from the industry that there's a problem, and there has to be acknowledgement there's a problem, and I think we need to go towards improving on those problems. I think that would be my generic recommendations on this problem.
And then finally, Geneva. The pair of you, any joint thoughts on what happens next?
Well, I think you ask what can accelerate this process. And I think I want to mention that the ILO has a supervisory mechanisms and that complaints can be launched when the convention is violated. We've received this year the first complaint for insufficient manning against an ILO member state. So reporting on these kind of violations also at the highest level can also allow us to accelerate it, to have concrete elements to move forward. But I don't want to end with the complaints part. I want to end with a meeting of the STC next year and the tripartite discussion that will certainly lead us to some kind of concrete actions, hopefully.
Thank you. Yeah, from my perspective, I think there is a need to harmonize the termination of manning, minimum safe manning. We should stop confusions about the terms minimum manning an appropriate man, a ship appropriately manned, because this is something that is being confused for ages. And I think it's the same concept, but it's used differently depending on the approach. And we should have a first set of mandatory provisions with sufficient detail in relation to manning. And lastly, which I think is quite relevant, and I think is not for us, but is for ILO, is to consider how to address the issue of maximum periods of service. Thank you.
Perfect. As ever with these conversations, we run out of time before we even start scratching the surface. I would recommend anybody listening to read the reports, but perhaps start with the original report and then the second one. And that should give you some depth of quite how long this issue has been looked at on an academic basis, and then might put into context some of these regulatory and industry discussions that we're having. We will continue to follow this on Lloyd's List, and I'm not spilling too many secrets when I say that there is probably a forthcoming podcast on exactly this topic, and I will endeavour to get some industry views to add to these expert panel. But thank you to the panel. Thank you, Michelle and Raphael and Bikram and Beatrice and Ishmael and Leanne. Thank you to the ITF Seafarers Trust and to the WMU for putting this on. And thank you for listening. Cheers. Goodbye.